The sharp metallic click of a silver lighter echoing in a private dining room is a sound I will never forget. It was a cold Tuesday evening in early March, the kind of night where the wind bites through your coat and settles deep into your bones. But the chill outside was nothing compared to the freezing atmosphere inside that upscale downtown restaurant. The air in our secluded room smelled heavily of roasted garlic, expensive red wine, and my mother Rowena's signature floral perfume. It was a suffocating combination. I sat stiffly in my velvet chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to control the uneven rhythm of my breathing. Across the table sat the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, my father Thaddeus and my mother Rowena. Right beside them, looking bored and entitled as always, was my younger sister Waverly. My fiancé Merrick sat to my left, his jaw clenched so hard I could see a muscle feathering in his cheek. He reached under the table, his warm hand wrapping around my freezing fingers, offering a silent anchor in a room full of sharks. Between us, resting on the pristine white linen tablecloth, sat a heavy, cream-colored envelope. My wedding invitation. I was 37 years old, a senior compliance investigator for a federal oversight agency. I hunted down white-collar criminals and exposed financial frauds for a living. Yet, sitting across from my parents, I felt like a terrified teenager all over again. I had invited them to dinner to lay down some ground rules. My upcoming wedding was going to be a small, highly secure affair. I was currently consulting on a massive, high-profile documentary exposing the troubled teen industry, specifically a horrific place called Serenity Pines Behavioral Center. It was the exact same facility my parents had exiled me to when I was 16 years old. Because of my involvement in the documentary, the press was starting to circle. I handed them the wedding invitation along with a strict media boundary agreement. I explained, keeping my voice as steady and professional as possible, that I just wanted them to show up as my parents. I needed them to respect my privacy, avoid speaking to any journalists who might try to crash the event, and refrain from trying to control the narrative of my own life. My father Thaddeus did not even reach for the cream-colored envelope. He did not look at the elegant calligraphy spelling out his name. Instead, he reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a folded legal document, and slid it across the table toward me. It was a non-disclosure agreement. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass, and stated his terms. He demanded that I sign away my right to ever speak publicly about my youth, about Serenity Pines, and about our family history. He wanted me to legally gag myself before he would even consider walking his eldest daughter down the aisle. I looked at the harsh black ink on the legal paper, then up at his cold, unyielding eyes. I pushed the document back across the table. I told him my trauma was not a corporate secret to be managed, and my boundaries were not up for negotiation. That was the exact moment the carefully constructed mask of civility slipped from my mother's face. Rowena did not argue. She did not yell. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a heavy silver lighter. Without breaking eye contact with me, her eyes dark and empty of any maternal warmth, she picked up my wedding invitation. She flicked the lighter. The flame sparked into existence, bright and aggressive in the dim light of the restaurant. Slowly, deliberately, she brought the flame to the corner of the thick, expensive paper. I sat paralyzed, watching the fire eat through the embossed gold lettering of my own name. The smell of burning paper and melting ink quickly overtook the aroma of the roasted garlic. The flame licked dangerously close to her perfectly manicured fingers, but she did not flinch. She let it burn until it was almost entirely consumed, then dropped the blackened, smoking remains onto the empty ceramic bread plate in the center of the table. She leaned forward, her lips curling into a vicious sneer. Her voice dropped into that familiar, venomous register she reserved only for me. "Don't flatter yourself, Trash. We are funding your sister's $100,000 real wedding instead of this garbage." Waverly, sitting right next to her, crossed her arms and let out a soft, mocking laugh. She did not look horrified by our mother's cruelty. She looked victorious, like she had just won a prize. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy enough to crush my lungs. The ashes of my invitation smoldered on the white plate, a physical manifestation of exactly what I meant to them. I was nothing. I was a nuisance. I was a piece of trash meant to be discarded and burned so the golden child could shine even brighter. I did not scream. I did not throw my glass of water in her face. I did not cry. Crying was a weakness they had always used as ammunition against me. Instead, a terrifying, icy calm washed over my entire body. I pulled my cell phone from my purse, opened the camera application, and snapped a clear, high-resolution photo of the charred paper resting right next to my father's pristine non-disclosure agreement. I stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the front of my dress to show that my hands were not shaking. I looked my mother dead in the eye, my face devoid of any emotion she could feed on, and offered a single, sharp nod. "Got it," I said. My voice was steady, betraying none of the earthquake tearing through my chest. Merrick stood up instantly, putting a protective hand on the small of my back. He did not say a single word to them, knowing his anger would only feed their twisted sense of power. We turned our backs and walked out of the private dining room, leaving them alone with the ashes of their own making. When the heavy wooden door of the restaurant closed behind me, I thought that was the end of a family. I truly believed I was just walking away to cut my losses and heal in peace. But I did not know that the pile of ashes on that dinner plate was the spark that would soon burn their entire empire to the ground. How far would you go if the people who gave you life tried to burn your future? The ride home was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. The vibrant city lights blurred past the car windows in streaks of yellow and red, bleeding into the dark night. Merrick kept his eyes on the road, holding my hand the entire time. His thumb traced slow, grounding circles on my knuckles, silently telling me that I was safe, that I was not the trash my mother claimed I was. I stared out into the darkness, feeling a strange, hollow sensation spreading through my ribs, taking up residence where my heart used to be. My apartment was profoundly quiet when we finally walked through the front door. It was a beautiful, spacious place I had bought with my own money, earned through grueling federal overtime and relentless ambition. There was not a single trace of Thaddeus or Rowena in this sanctuary. No heirloom furniture they could hold over my head, no decorative plates gifted with hidden strings attached, no lingering scent of floral perfume. It was entirely mine. Merrick gently took my coat, pressing a soft kiss to my temple, and went into the kitchen to brew some chamomile tea. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator, and finally allowed the hollow feeling to crack wide open. The sting of being called trash by my own mother was not a new wound. It was a very old, very deep scar ripped open without anesthesia, bleeding fresh resentment into my system. I walked into my home office, the only room in the house I kept strictly locked, and opened the bottom drawer of my heavy metal filing cabinet. Inside rested a worn cardboard box. I pulled it out, set it on my desk, and turned on the small reading lamp. This box was my museum of pain. Every item inside was a silent witness to a lifetime of systemic emotional starvation. I reached in and pulled out a faded, crumpled receipt from an appliance store, dated over 2 decades ago. It was for a small mini-fridge with an external padlock. When I was 14 years old, Waverly had demanded I do her middle school science project for her. When I refused, telling her I had my own exams to study for, she threw a massive tantrum. She intentionally knocked a heavy crystal vase off the hallway table, shattering it into pieces, and then started screaming, blaming me for pushing her. Rowena did not ask for my side of the story. Her punishment was not grounding me. Instead, she took a heavy metal chain and padlocked the main kitchen refrigerator. She told me I was not allowed to consume the family's food until I learned to be a supportive and obedient sister. I remembered the gnawing, acidic pain of hunger tearing at my stomach that weekend. I remembered taking my meager, hard-earned babysitting money, walking 3 miles to the hardware store, buying that cheap mini-fridge, and hiding it in the back of my closet just so I could have a slice of bread and some peanut butter without begging for my basic survival. I put the receipt down and picked up a photograph. It was my high school graduation picture. I was holding my diploma cover, wearing a borrowed white dress, standing entirely alone on the sprawling green lawn of the school. Thaddeus had forced me to leave my own graduation ceremony halfway through. Why? Because 12-year-old Waverly had tripped in the parking lot, scraped her knee on the asphalt, and loudly declared she needed her family around her. They physically dragged me out before my name was even called across the stage. I remembered sitting in the back seat of his luxury sedan, clutching my empty diploma cover, staring at my sister's tiny, insignificant bandage while Rowena cooed and fussed over her as if she had just survived a war zone. The next item was a printed email. It was an official notification for a full-ride academic scholarship to a prestigious out-of-state university. It was worth $120,000. Rowena had intercepted the mail, logged into my student portal, and deleted the digital notifications. I only found out about it 3 years later when I requested my old high school transcripts for a background check. Because she hid that letter, I spent 4 years of college working 3 grueling jobs. I served burning hot coffee at dawn, filed endless stacks of paper in a law office in the afternoon, and cleaned library floors at midnight, fueled by nothing but cheap instant noodles and sheer spite. She did not hide the scholarship because they needed the money. She hid it because she was terrified that if I became financially independent, I would leave and she would lose her favorite punching bag. I stared at the artifacts spread across my desk. The cruelty was never accidental. It was a calculated, daily campaign to keep me small, to ensure all the resources, love, and attention flowed directly to the golden child. I traced the edge of the graduation photo, feeling the familiar, heavy armor sliding back into place around my heart. I was a survivor. I had built a thriving career in federal compliance by hunting down criminals, dissecting their lies, and holding them accountable. Yet, I had let the 2 biggest frauds in my life walk away without a single scratch. Merrick walked into the office, setting a steaming mug of tea on the desk. He looked at the box, then at the scattered evidence of my ruined childhood. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell me to forgive, forget, or take the high road. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes dark with a quiet, dangerous fury. "They don't get to burn you down and walk away warm," he said softly. I picked up the mug, the heat seeping into my freezing hands. I had intended to bury the past. I really had. I thought drawing a boundary would be enough to protect my future. But as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, a dangerous, cold clarity washed over me. Until that night, I did not realize that the ghosts of my past were tired of being quiet. I was going to let it go. Up until 9 o'clock on Monday morning, when the front desk receptionist at the federal building handed me a padded envelope with no return address. What was hiding inside that package? The federal building where I worked always smelled of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and ozone from the massive copy machines. It was an environment of strict order, rigid rules, and undeniable facts. I sat at my large oak desk, the morning sunlight filtering through the heavy blinds, and stared at the brown padded envelope resting directly on my keyboard. There was no return address. The postage stamp indicated it had been mailed from a small, rural town 2 hours upstate. I reached for my brass letter opener, sliding the cold metal blade under the flap. The glue gave way with a harsh, ripping sound that seemed far too loud in the quiet office. I tipped the envelope over. A small, stiff object slid out and hit the wooden desk with a dry, hollow clatter. It was a faded plastic hospital bracelet. The plastic was severely yellowed with age, the edges brittle and sharp. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the raised, black lettering. My name was printed on it, my date of birth, and a facility admission date from exactly 21 years ago. The bold letters reading Serenity Pines Behavioral Center seemed to scream up at me from the sterile surface of my desk. My breath hitched in my throat. The familiar smell of the federal building vanished, instantly replaced by a phantom punch to the face, the suffocating stench of heavy industrial bleach, moldy carpet, and overcooked cafeteria food. I was 16 again, standing in a windowless hallway, listening to the heavy security doors lock shut behind me, trapping me in a nightmare. There was a small piece of lined notebook paper folded inside the envelope. I pulled it out and flattened it against the desk with shaking hands. The handwriting was neat, slightly hurried, written in blue ink. Your mother was never banned from the treatment wing. She chose to sit in the lobby. She came every single month, signed the papers, and left you there. Jay. I stopped breathing. The low hum of the air conditioner faded into a dull, rushing roar in my ears. For 21 years, the established narrative was that Serenity Pines had a strict, non-negotiable no-contact policy for the first year of a teenager's treatment. Rowena had cried endless crocodile tears at family Thanksgiving dinners, telling sympathetic aunts and uncles how heartbroken she was that the cruel doctors forbade her from seeing her troubled, rebellious daughter. She played the tragic, helpless mother role perfectly. I grabbed my computer mouse, my knuckles turning white. As a senior compliance investigator, I had high-level security clearance to access state judicial databases and defunct facility licensing records. I was strictly not supposed to use this access for personal matters, but the rules no longer mattered. Not today. My fingers flew across the keyboard in a frantic blur, bypassing security firewalls and pulling up the old state archive portals for Serenity Pines. I cross-referenced the specific barcode number printed on the old plastic bracelet. The antiquated system lagged for a few agonizing seconds, the loading icon spinning mockingly on the screen, before finally spitting out a heavily redacted administrative log. I scrolled down, my eyes frantically scanning the harsh, glowing text. The code on the bracelet did not belong to the patient treatment ward. It was an administrative visitor code. I pulled up the logged facility visits for the year 2003. There it was. The first Thursday of every single month. Rowena's full name was officially stamped in the digital system. She had walked through the front doors, checked into the reception desk, sat in the comfortable leather chairs of the lobby, drank their complimentary coffee, and signed the operational extension forms to keep me locked inside. She had been less than 50 feet away from me while I was sitting in a freezing group therapy room, crying and praying for someone to save me. She had been right there, in the same building, and she had chosen to walk away and drive back to her comfortable suburban home. Every single month, a wave of pure nausea washed over me, fast and incredibly violent. I shoved my heavy office chair back, the wheels screeching against the floor, and paced the length of my office. I dragged a hand through my hair, trying to ground myself in reality. The betrayal was so profound it felt physical, like a rusted knife twisting repeatedly between my ribs. She didn't just abandon me, she actively, willingly participated in my imprisonment while playing the devastated victim to the outside world. I stopped by the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, looking down at the busy city streets below. The crushing weight of sadness began to morph into something else entirely. Something sharp, hot, and intensely focused. The sadness burned away like fog under a scorching sun, leaving behind a cold, calculated fury. If she had lied so effortlessly about this, what else was hiding in the dark shadows of my childhood? I picked up my cell phone and dialed Merrick's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and steady. "I need your help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet harder than solid steel. "I need you to look into the architectural files your firm pulled for the Serenity Pines redevelopment project. I need you to find a way into the financial basement archives." Merrick didn't ask why. He didn't tell me to calm down or think things through. He just said, "Give me an hour. I'll meet you at Gideon's office." The ghost of my past had just handed me a loose thread. And as I stared at that yellowed plastic bracelet, I promised myself I would pull that thread until the entire fabric of my family's lies unraveled into nothing. The truth about my mother was devastating enough. But what Merrick and the forensic accountant found waiting in the financial ledgers would reveal that my father was a monster of a completely different breed. What kind of parent puts a price tag on their child's freedom? Gideon was a brilliant forensic accountant who frequently worked as a contractor with my federal agency on incredibly complex fraud and embezzlement cases. He was a quiet, unassuming man who lived for untangling messy spreadsheets and hunting down hidden money trails. His office was a chaotic sanctuary of stacked paper files, empty coffee cups, and 3 glowing computer monitors. Merrick was already there when I arrived, leaning over Gideon's shoulder, pointing a laser pointer at a digitized architectural blueprint displayed on the center screen. Merrick's architecture firm had recently been hired by the state government to redesign the abandoned Serenity Pines campus into a modern commercial storage facility. In doing so, his team had to map the old, crumbling basement levels, accidentally uncovering rows of locked filing cabinets the original liquidation company had forgotten to shred when the facility went bankrupt and shut down. "We pulled the structural ground scans," Merrick said, greeting me with a brief, reassuring kiss on the forehead. "And we found a massive discrepancy in the original facility blueprints. There was a secondary records room hidden behind the boiler room walls." Gideon managed to legally subpoena the salvaged hard drives from the state receivership based on an anonymous fraud tip we filed this morning. I pulled up a chair, my heart pounding a steady, aggressive rhythm against my ribs. The air in the room felt incredibly thick. "Show me what you found." Gideon pushed his thick-rimmed glasses up his nose and clicked a yellow folder on his desktop. "Serenity Pines was a financial goldmine," he began, his voice flat and professional, which only made the horror of his words sound even worse. "They charged desperate parents exorbitant tuition fees, claiming to offer top-tier psychological care. But that's not the interesting part of their business model, Sloan. The truly interesting part is how they recruited their patients." He opened a massive spreadsheet. Endless columns of dates, patient names, and transaction ID numbers flooded the bright screen. He highlighted a specific, recurring vendor account in bright yellow. The vendor name was Thorne Logistics. My maiden name was Thorne. My father, Thaddeus Thorne, was a former corporate supply chain director. "Thorne Logistics," Gideon explained, tracing a digital pen over the screen to emphasize the data, was a shell company registered in Delaware. "Your father set it up exactly 3 months before you were admitted to Serenity Pines." I leaned closer, the harsh blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, trying to make sense of the letters. "What did this company actually supply to the facility?" "Nothing," Gideon replied grimly. "It was a phantom entity. It had no employees, no warehouse, no actual products. But it held a highly lucrative consulting contract with the behavioral center. According to these recovered financial ledgers, Thorne Logistics received a performance bonus based directly on referral and retention rates." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the computer tower beneath the desk. I stared at the numbers, my brain struggling to process the sheer depravity of what I was looking at. "Retention rates?" I choked out, the words feeling like sandpaper in my throat. Gideon clicked on another archived document, bringing up a scanned, itemized invoice. Every time a patient's stay was extended by 30 days, the referring consultant received a financial cut. "Your father didn't pay tuition to keep you there, Sloan. He received a massive kickback." He highlighted a specific column on the invoice. $2,500. "That is exactly how much Thorne Logistics was paid by the facility for every single month you remained locked behind those doors." I felt the blood drain rapidly from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. I was trapped in that nightmare facility for 1,200 days. I did the math in my head, the numbers hitting me like physical, brutal blows to the stomach. $100,000. My father had sold my teenage years, my freedom, and my mental sanity for $100,000 in blood money. Every time I cried myself to sleep on a thin mattress, every time I begged the staff to let me call home, every time Rowena sat in that comfortable lobby and signed an extension form citing my rebellious and defiant behavior, Thaddeus was cashing a corporate check. "Where did the money go?" Merrick asked, his voice rough with suppressed rage. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. Gideon typed a quick query into the database, tracking the routing numbers from the shell company's outgoing bank transfers. He pulled up a scanned bank statement from 20 years ago. "The funds intentionally bypassed your father's primary checking accounts to avoid tax scrutiny. They were deposited directly into a private wealth management trust." He turned the large monitor slightly toward me. The beneficiary name on the trust account was printed clearly in bold, black letters. Waverly Thorne. The remaining air was violently sucked out of the room. I gripped the edge of Gideon's desk so hard my fingernails dug deep into the cheap wood veneer. They didn't just sell my freedom. They used the blood money to buy my sister's first luxury car. They used it to fund her expensive European backpacking vacations. They used my blood, sweat, and tears to pave a smooth road of gold for the favorite child. My parents had literally weaponized my existence to finance their perfect daughter. I didn't cry. The time for crying had died on the cold floor of that facility 21 years ago. I stood up, smoothing my skirt with terrifying, mechanical precision. The shock was entirely gone. The hurt was gone. What remained was the sharp, unyielding edge of a federal investigator who had just found the ultimate smoking gun. "Print everything," I told Gideon, my voice echoing coldly off the office walls. "I want every single invoice, every bank routing number, every forged signature. I want the entire paper trail bound in a legal folder." Merrick stepped closer, his presence a solid, grounding wall of support at my back. "What are you going to do with it?" I looked at the digitized blueprint of the facility where they had tried to break me, mapping out the exact dimensions of my former prison. "I'm going to let them build their own gallows. And then I am going to pull the lever." I thought I had reached the absolute bottom of their depravity. But the universe has a very funny way of testing your limits. The very next day, the Golden Child herself decided to pay me an unexpected visit, bringing a level of audacity that would cement my plan in stone. Would she ever realize that her luxury life was built entirely on my bones? The security guard stationed in the main lobby of the federal building called my direct office extension just after lunch on Thursday. He sounded hesitant, clearing his throat before mentioning that a young woman aggressively claiming to be my sister was causing a massive disturbance near the security turnstiles. I closed my eyes, rubbed my temples to ward off an incoming headache, and sighed. I told him I would be right down to handle it. When I stepped out of the elevator onto the ground floor, the sound of Waverly's shrill, complaining voice echoed obnoxiously off the polished marble walls of the lobby. She was standing directly in front of the security desk, wearing a designer trench coat, oversized sunglasses indoors, and carrying a leather handbag that probably cost more than my first used car. Standing right beside her, looking bored, arrogant, and chewing gum loudly, was her fiancé, Corin. Corin was a self-proclaimed freelance lifestyle coach, which was really just a polite, modern way of saying he lived comfortably off Waverly's trust fund while pretending to be an important entrepreneur on the internet. Finally, Waverly huffed, dramatically crossing her arms and tapping her expensive heel on the floor as I approached. "Your security guards are incredibly rude, Sloan. They treated me like a criminal. I told them I was family and demanded to be led up to your office." "You don't have federal clearance, Waverly," I said flatly, keeping a safe distance from them. "What do you want?" "I'm working on a major case." Corin smirked, casually adjusting the popped collar of his expensive polo shirt. "We're actually here to talk about the massive mess you made at dinner the other night. You really upset Rowena, you know. Walking out like that was super toxic energy. You ruined the vibe." I stared at him for a long moment, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of this useless man lecturing me about toxic energy while standing in a building where I hunted actual criminals for a living. Waverly stepped forward, pulling off her sunglasses. Her face adopted that practiced, pouty victim look she had perfected since she was 5 years old. "Mom is incredibly stressed out, Sloan. Because of your little theatrical stunt with the invitation and the NDA, she's threatening to cut the floral budget for my wedding. You made things awkward for everyone, and now I have to deal with the unfair financial fallout." I crossed my arms, feeling the cold, hard weight of Gideon's printed financial reports sitting in my desk upstairs. "Your wedding budget is not my responsibility." "Actually, it kind of is," Waverly retorted, flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. Her logic was so deeply twisted it was almost fascinating to observe in the wild. "You owe me a massive apology for ruining the family dinner. But Corin and I talked about it in the car, and we are willing to forgive you and smooth things over with Mom if you help us out. We want $50,000 to upgrade our honeymoon to a luxury suite in Paris. Consider it an early wedding gift to make up for your behavior. It's the least you can do to make peace and fix the family." She demanded $50,000. The exact amount her private trust fund had swallowed from the first 2 years of my captivity at Serenity Pines. I looked at my younger sister. I looked past the expensive clothes, the perfect hair, and the arrogant posture, and I saw exactly what she was, a parasite. She was a 34-year-old woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, standing in my workplace, demanding a massive cash payout simply because I had the nerve to refuse our parents' emotional abuse. She didn't care that they had literally set my wedding invitation on fire. She only cared that the fire might accidentally singe her precious inheritance. "You want me to write you a check for $50,000, I repeated slowly, letting the heavy words hang in the air between us. Yes, Corin chimed in eagerly, his eyes lighting up at the prospect of free money. It's a very fair compromise for the emotional distress you caused Waverly. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene or give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its clueless prey wander straight into a steel trap. "I won't give you a single dime, Waverly," I said, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying enough authority to make Corin step back. "In fact, I highly recommend you start looking for a real job immediately. Update your resume. Because very soon, that magical trust fund of yours is going to run completely dry." Waverly's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You are just jealous. You've always been horribly jealous that Mom and Dad love me more. You are a bitter, selfish." I didn't let her finish her rehearsed tantrum. I turned directly to the armed security guard, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes and a hand resting near his radio. "Officer, these individuals do not have an appointment and they are harassing federal personnel. Please escort them off the property immediately. If they resist or cause a scene, feel free to detain them for trespassing." Waverly gasped loudly, taking a stumbling step back as the large guard moved purposefully toward them. "You're crazy, Sloane. Mom was right about you being unstable," she shrieked as Corin hastily grabbed her arm, practically dragging her toward the revolving glass doors to avoid being physically removed by security. I stood in the cold marble lobby and watched them scurry away into the busy street. The anger that used to cripple me in my youth was entirely gone. I felt nothing but a clinical, chilling detachment. Their blindness was pathetic, but I knew exactly who had trained them to be this way. That evening, the rain was pouring down in heavy, relentless sheets, washing the city streets clean of the day's grime. I parked my car outside a rundown, neon-lit diner on the far outskirts of town. The sign buzzed erratically in the dark. It was time to meet the ghost who had sent the hospital bracelet. It was time to find out exactly how deep my mother's hatred truly ran. The diner smelled heavily of old frying grease, stale black coffee, and wet wool. It was a depressing place, nearly empty save for a tired truck driver nodding off at the counter and a frail-looking woman sitting alone in a dim corner booth. I recognized her immediately, even though 21 hard years had aged her significantly, carving deep lines of worry into her face. Her name was Juno. She had been a junior nurse working the night shift at Serenity Pines. She was the one who used to quietly sneak me extra saltine crackers when the director placed me in isolation for refusing to confess to sins I hadn't committed. I slid into the sticky vinyl booth across from her, the plastic squeaking under my weight. Juno looked terrified, her trembling hands wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic coffee mug. She wore a faded beige raincoat, her graying hair pulled back into a messy, uneven bun. "You came," she whispered, her voice raspy and thin. "You sent the hospital bracelet to my federal office," I replied, skipping all pleasantries and cutting straight to the point. "You wrote the note saying my mother was in the lobby. I verified it. I found the visitor logs in the state database. I know she signed the monthly extensions. What else do you have, Juno? Why come forward now after 2 decades of silence?" Juno looked down at the scratched table, a profound, crushing shame settling over her tired features. "I saw the press release online about the documentary you are consulting on. I saw your name, Sloane. The guilt, it's been eating me alive for 2 decades. I watched what they did to you. I watched what your mother did to you. I couldn't carry it anymore." She reached into her oversized, water-stained tote bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook. It looked like an old, Official administrative log. She pushed it across the sticky table toward me with shaking fingers. They ordered the nursing staff to intercept all outgoing mail, Juno said, her voice shaking with unshed tears. Any letters that contained complaints, allegations of physical abuse, or desperate pleas to go home were immediately confiscated by the facility director. It was standard protocol to keep the parents paying. My stomach tightened into a painful knot. I know they took them. I wrote dozens of letters. I begged for help. None of them ever made it out. That's not the whole truth, Sloane, Juno interrupted gently, placing a hand over mine. She reached out and opened the heavy notebook to a bookmarked page. The director didn't just throw your letters away in the trash. He handed them directly to the parents during their monthly administrative visits. He used them as proof that the children were still resisting treatment and needed more time. I stared at the yellowed page. It was a handwritten log of confiscated contraband. Right next to my name, dated in October of my first year in captivity, was an entry for 5 outgoing letters. In the column next to it, officially confirming receipt of the items, was a signature in blue ink. Rowena Thorne. She took them. I asked, my voice cracking slightly despite my best efforts to stay detached and professional. She read my letters begging for help, detailing how they treated me, and she took them? Juno nodded, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. I was at the front desk one afternoon filling in for the main receptionist. Your mother read your letter right there in the lobby. You wrote about how cold it was, how they locked you in a room with no windows for 3 days straight just for crying. I remember it clearly because it broke my heart. What did she do? I demanded, leaning forward across the table. Juno let out a ragged, uneven breath. She laughed. A quiet, scoffing little laugh, like she was reading a funny joke. She told the director you were always overly dramatic and manipulative. Then, she asked him if he had a paper shredder she could use. But the shredder in the lobby was broken that week. So, she took a silver lighter out of her purse. She walked out to the parking lot, stood by her expensive luxury car, and she burned your letters in a metal trash can. I watched her from the window. The diner faded away. The smell of grease was instantly replaced by the phantom smell of lighter fluid and burning paper. Rowena hadn't just burned my wedding invitation last week. She had a long, established history of setting my words on fire. Why? I asked, the word tasting like dry ash in my mouth. Why did she hate me so much? What did I do to deserve that? It wasn't just hate, Sloane, Juno said softly, wiping her eyes. It was fear. She was having a drink with the director one night after a charity gala event. I overheard her talking in the hallway. She said you were too smart, too observant. She was terrified that as you grew older, you would figure out your father's financial setup with the facility. But more than that, she was incredibly jealous of you. You were fiercely independent. You didn't need her. Waverly needed her constantly to survive, which made your mother feel powerful and important. You made her feel small and unnecessary. She locked you up to systematically break your spirit. She locked me up to break my spirit. I traced my mother's cursive signature in the logbook. The puzzle was finally complete. Thaddeus did it for the money. Rowena did it for the power and control. They had intentionally sacrificed their eldest daughter on the altar of their own insecurities and boundless greed. I took the notebook, placing it securely inside my leather briefcase. I looked at Juno, seeing the broken woman who had been a silent accomplice to a deeply corrupt system. Are you willing to testify? I asked her, my voice returning to its investigative steel. When the time comes, will you swear to everything you just told me in a legal deposition on camera? Juno sat up a little straighter, a spark of genuine resolve finally breaking through her years of fear. Yes, whatever it takes to bring them down. I paid for her coffee, walked out into the cold, pouring rain, and sat in my car. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers matched the beating of my heart. I had the financial records. I had the eyewitness. I had the undeniable motive. The pieces were aligning perfectly. The war was inevitable, and I was going to ensure that the battlefield was broadcast live for the entire world to see. The betrayal of your own parents is a poison that corrodes you from the inside out. If you've ever had to cut ties with a toxic family to save yourself, leave a comment below. We're not alone. Thank you for watching this far. Comment, "I'm Win," to let me know you're a true warrior. I'll like and reply to every comment containing the keyword "I'm Win." Now, let's see how I set a trap for them. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I had enough paper evidence to ruin them financially. But the law requires an undeniable punch. And my journalist friend Alistair was about to bring me a weapon they could never, ever deny. I was about to uncover the darkest secret hidden in the vault of my childhood home. The rain continued to hammer against the glass windows of Alistair's downtown office, as if it were trying to wash away the sins of the entire city. Alistair was an investigative journalist with silvering hair, tired eyes, and a relentless nose for corruption. He had spent decades uncovering white-collar criminals, but when I dropped the financial ledgers of Thorn Logistics and Juno's nurse logs onto his desk, even he sat back in his chair and whistled softly. "Your parents didn't just run a family, Sloan," Alistair said, flipping through the copied pages with a grim expression. "They ran a criminal enterprise disguised as a suburban household. But corporate fraud and administrative logs, as damning as they are, deal in paperwork. To make a national broadcast weep and scream, to truly break the illusion of their untouchable perfection, we need visual proof. We need the physical genesis of how they justified sending you away." I crossed my arms, leaning against the cold metal filing cabinet. They claimed I was violent. They claimed I attacked Waverly and threw a tantrum that endangered her life. That was the official psychiatric justification written into my intake file at Serenity Pines. Alistair tapped a pencil against his teeth. "And you said that night never happened the way they wrote it?" "It didn't," I said, my voice dropping into a flat, dangerous register. "Thaddeus was the one throwing things. I was shielding my sister, and they turned it around to save themselves." "Then we need the raw footage from 21 years ago," Alistair said, leaning forward. "Your father was a corporate executive. Men like that digitize everything, but they are arrogant. They think paper trails vanish and digital files stay buried forever. Did your family ever keep home video archives?" The question hit me like a sudden gust of wind. I remembered the heavy, walnut-paneled media closet in the basement of my childhood home. I remembered Thaddeus sitting at his bulky desktop computer in the fall of 2003, just days before I was hauled away to Serenity Pines, ordering his corporate IT staff to digitize boxes of old mini-DV tapes. He had packed up the physical media and shipped it off to a commercial corporate storage facility downtown. But he never kept the original source media in the house after that conversion process. "Whitmore Development Strategies," I murmured, remembering the corporate logo stamped on the transfer slips. My father used his corporate storage vendor to archive old family media. But those boxes were filed under commercial property holdings during his company's restructuring years ago. Alistair didn't hesitate. He picked up his desk phone, dialed a contact at a specialized media recovery lab, and began pulling legal strings. Because the storage facility operated under corporate commercial codes, we couldn't just break in. We needed an emergency preservation order and a neutral forensic laboratory to subpoena the exact inventory box. It took us 3 agonizing days of relentless legal maneuvering, phone calls with corporate bureaucrats, and emergency court filings overseen by a sympathetic judge. By Friday afternoon, the third-party commercial storage vendor finally confirmed they had located the specific box. Box 14. Misfiled years ago under an old commercial real estate holding, sitting silently in a climate-controlled vault deep in an industrial park. Alistair and I didn't wait. We drove straight to the Independent Media Laboratory, where the box was scheduled to be delivered under a secure chain of custody. The laboratory was a windowless, climate-controlled concrete building that hummed with the constant, heavy sound of massive server towers and cooling fans. The air smelled of ozone and sterile electronics. A certified audiovisual forensic technician, a quiet man wearing white cotton gloves, carefully broke the original corporate seal on Box 14 while Alistair documented the entire process with a high-resolution camera. Inside the dusty cardboard container sat a single, weathered mini-DV cassette tape. A small handwritten label on the plastic casing read, Whitmore Family Incident Raw Mini DV Source. The technician carefully loaded the small plastic rectangle into a specialized professional playback deck, routing the high-definition signal directly to a massive monitor mounted on the white laboratory wall. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The moment of absolute truth. The technician hit play. The screen flickered, displaying the continuous, unbroken timecode of raw digital footage recorded 21 years ago. And suddenly, we were standing in my childhood living room. The recording quality was grainy and washed out by the harsh indoor lighting, but the events played out with a terrifying, crystal-clear clarity that took my breath away. On screen, a younger Thaddeus towered over the mahogany coffee table, his face completely distorted by blind, uncontrollable rage. He was screaming at Waverly over a minor broken item. Without warning, he grabbed a heavy, solid bronze bookend and hurled it across the room with terrifying force, aiming directly at my 11-year-old sister's head. On screen, my 16-year-old self lunged forward with a desperate cry, grabbing Waverly by the shoulders and pulling her violently down toward the carpet just as the heavy bronze object smashed into the wall behind us. As I shielded her head with my arms, my sister's side slammed hard against the sharp wooden edge of the coffee table. We crumpled to the floor together, tangled, crying and gasping for air. The visual evidence was already damning enough to destroy him. But the real nightmare began the moment the room fell silent on the recording. On screen, I expected to hear my father drop to his knees, apologize, or scream for an ambulance. Instead, Thaddeus stepped right over the shattered glass, looked directly at Rowena, and delivered a cold, calculated instruction that froze the blood in my veins. "Call the program," he said, his voice completely devoid of any human emotion. "Tell them she attacked her sister." Rowena did not scream. She did not run to check on her injured youngest child. The woman who had raised us simply nodded, crossed her arms over her chest, and asked Thaddeus what exact time they should claim the assault occurred so it would neatly align with the facility admission intake schedule. They hadn't just exaggerated a fight. They had weaponized my attempt to save my sister's life, turned it into a manufactured crime, and used it to lock me away while they cashed corporate checks from Thorn Logistics. The laboratory monitor faded to black. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. I stared at the dark glass of the monitor, a profound, chilling wave of validation washing over me. I wasn't crazy. I was never the monster they painted me to be. Alistair lowered his camera, looking at me with deep, solemn respect. "We have them, Sloane. This tape destroys every single lie they built their lives upon." With the raw videotape secured in the forensic lab's safe and the financial ledgers fully compiled, Alistair and I began preparing the final investigative piece for the National Documentary Network. The producers were ecstatic. The scope of the corruption reached far beyond a simple family dispute. It was a systemic takedown of a fraudulent behavioral facility and its corporate enablers. However, cornered animals fight the hardest. And my parents were about to prove just how vicious they could be when their gilded cage began to collapse. It started on a rainy Monday morning when my federal agency supervisor called me into his glass-walled office. He looked uneasy, holding a thick, cream-colored legal binder bearing the corporate letterhead of a high-end crisis management and legal defense firm. "Sloane," my supervisor said, sliding the binder across his polished desk. "A package was delivered to our Internal Affairs Department this morning marked confidential. It's directed at you." I opened the binder without a word. Inside lay a comprehensive, meticulously crafted psychological dossier detailing my supposed severe mental instability, aggressive paranoia, and a malicious, vindictive campaign I was allegedly waging against my own elderly parents. Thaddeus and Rowena had hired an expensive crisis PR firm to overnight this toxic trash directly to my employers in a desperate attempt to strip me of my federal security clearance, discredit my investigations, and force my termination before the documentary could air. They had even included manipulated excerpts of my old teenage letters from Serenity Pines, surgically slicing the paragraphs apart to make my desperate pleas look like the ravings of an unhinged, Violent sociopath while conveniently erasing every sentence where I begged for help or requested legal counsel. My supervisor watched me closely, waiting for a breakdown. He knew my history vaguely, but federal agencies take internal conduct very seriously. Instead of panicking, I let out a calm, measured breath. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a duplicate flash drive containing the forensic lab's certified copy of the raw mini-DV tape, the financial ledgers from Gideon, and Juno's signed nurse logs, and laid them neatly on his desk. Before your team opens an inquiry based on that trash, sir, I suggest you review this evidence, I said smoothly. That binder is an act of retaliatory defamation by subjects currently under federal investigation for white-collar financial fraud and child institutional abuse. My attorney has already drafted the counterfilings. My supervisor blinked, opening the flash drive folder. It took him less than 10 minutes of reading the financial kickback invoices and watching the 10-second clip of Thaddeus throwing the bronze bookend to realize he was holding a political and legal hand grenade. Good God, Sloan, he whispered, pushing the binder away as if it were contaminated. Do whatever you need to do. Just keep our agency out of the crossfire when this explodes. I walked out of his office with my head held high. My parents had tried to use my workplace to destroy me, exactly the way they had tried to destroy my mind 21 years ago. But they had underestimated who I had become. I wasn't a 16-year-old trapped behind locked doors anymore. I was a federal compliance investigator, and I held all the cards. That evening, Alistair coordinated with the network executives to finalize the release schedule. The documentary producers wanted to host a massive, live-streamed fundraising gala and survivor awareness event. And a wealthy, anonymous philanthropist who turned out to be one of the senior executives at the Federal Oversight Foundation where I volunteered, offered his sprawling, ultra-exclusive $40 million Malibu estate as the venue. Maya Chin, the lead documentary producer, suggested concluding the live broadcast with Merrick and me exchanging our wedding vows right there on the cliffside lawns, framing our ceremony as the ultimate, definitive symbol of reclaimed agency and victory over systemic abuse. I looked at Merrick, seeing the unwavering, solid support shining in his eyes, and I agreed on one strict, non-negotiable condition. The ceremony could not involve any direct, messy confrontations with my family. I didn't want them anywhere near my wedding altar. We would let the truth speak for itself through the broadcast, while private security handled the perimeter. Little did we know, Thaddeus and Rowena had already caught wind of the upcoming Malibu broadcast through their high-priced PR network. And true to their narcissistic nature, they decided to launch a counteroffensive. They issued a public press release declaring that they were flying to Malibu to rescue their brainwashed daughter from a malicious media cult. The battle lines were officially drawn. And it was all going down on my wedding day. The salty, warm ocean breeze whipped fiercely across the manicured, emerald green lawns of the $40 million Malibu estate, carrying the faint, sweet scent of climbing jasmine from the massive floral arches erected near the edge of the jagged cliff. It was a masterpiece of architectural elegance and natural beauty. Yet, beneath the serene surface, the air buzzed with a tense, electric anticipation. This was not just a wedding. It was the execution of a 21-year-old sentence. I sat at a sleek glass patio table in the bridal suite overlooking the Pacific Ocean, reviewing the final legal clearance documents with my attorney. Just outside the heavy wooden doors, the catering crew was busy setting up crystal tables, while the production crew tested the massive, high-definition outdoor LED screens that would broadcast the documentary premiere to our distinguished guests. The head of private security, a towering man with a thick clipboard, stepped into the suite. I handed him 2 glossy, 8x10 professional photographs of Thaddeus and Rowena. If these 2 individuals approach the property, they are strictly prohibited from entering, I instructed him calmly, tapping the glossy paper. They do not have a physical invitation. Do not engage in arguments, do not lose your temper. Just ask them for a valid invitation, and when they fail to produce one, lock the wrought iron gates. The security chief nodded, his expression grim and professional. We handle high-profile gatecrashers every week, ma'am. Nobody gets past the perimeter without a scannable QR code or a gold embossed invite. Maya-chan walked into the suite a few minutes later, holding her production tablet tight against her chest like a shield. She took a sharp, excited breath. "Sloan, your parents just posted a public video online announcing they are standing right outside the main gates. They brought a handful of reporters from local tabloids with them. They're demanding to be let in to save you." I didn't flinch. I stood up slowly from the glass table, smoothing the heavy, exquisite silk of my wedding dress. It was a minimalist, breathtaking gown I had chosen myself, no heirloom veil, no borrowed lace tied to a history of lies. Just clean lines and absolute ownership of my own body. "Let them scream at the gates, Maya," I said steadily. "The broadcast is starting in 10 minutes. Let the world see who they really are." Outside, the string quartet began to play a soft, classical melody, the notes drifting out over the crashing ocean waves. I took a deep breath, feeling the solid, grounding weight of the moment, and stepped out onto the sunlit path. Down at the main entrance gates, miles away from the ceremony site, the climax was already unfolding under the harsh glare of camera flashbulbs. According to the perimeter security feeds we monitored on backstage monitors, a sleek black town car had pulled up directly to the heavy wrought iron estate gates. Thaddeus marched straight toward the security detail, adjusting his expensive silk tie, operating on the lifelong, arrogant assumption that his mere presence and corporate status commanded total, immediate compliance. Rowena walked right beside him, her posture rigid with self-righteous indignation. My mother stepped right up to the iron bars, glaring at the head of security, and announced loudly to the rolling news cameras that they were the beloved parents of the bride and demanded immediate entry. The head of private security did not flinch, nor did he raise his voice. He calmly checked his clipboard, looked back up, and asked the exact question we had prepared for them. "Do you have an invitation?" Rowena's face contorted in disbelief. She opened her designer leather clutch, reached inside, and pulled out a handful of jagged, burnt, and torn paper fragments. They were the very same charred pieces of my wedding invitation she had kept in her purse for months, intending to use them as twisted physical proof that I was the one creating unnecessary family drama. She tried to shove the burned scraps through the iron bars, screaming that she had every right to enter. The heavy metal gates remained firmly, unyielding closed. Instantly, frustration boiled over into public, sputtering outrage. Realizing the security guards were immune to his bullying, Thaddeus pivoted away from the gate and turned directly toward the bank of flashing press cameras Alastair had deliberately positioned outside the perimeter. He tried to hijack the narrative in real time, shouting to the reporters that I was a dangerous, mentally unstable individual being exploited by a malicious media conspiracy. His practiced, corporate mask held for exactly 30 seconds. Then, an investigative reporter from a major national network stepped forward through the crowd of cameras, holding a printed copy of the Thorn Logistics invoice. The journalist shoved the paper toward Thaddeus and asked my father to publicly explain the performance bonuses tied directly to my continued, illegal confinement at Serenity Pines. The live television camera caught the exact microsecond realization washed over my father's face, the terrifying comprehension that he could no longer control the room, manage the press, or hide his crimes. His face flushed a dark, violent, dangerous shade of crimson. The man who had prided himself on absolute corporate composure completely lost control. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at the camera lens, his voice cracking hysterically over the coastal wind. "She was destroying everything," Thaddeus yelled, losing his mind on live national television. Sending her away was the only way to stop her. He had just publicly confessed on live TV that my institutionalization was entirely about maintaining his authoritarian control and financial fraud, completely shattering the medical necessity lie he had peddled for 20 years. Beside him, realizing her husband had just confessed to a felony on national broadcast, Rowena's panic became absolute and entirely transparent. True to her narcissistic nature, the woman who prized family loyalty above all else instantly turned on her husband, screeching at Thaddeus that the financial arrangements were entirely his fault. before spinning back to the cameras to hysterically insist that I had always been a master manipulator. Their unified front of suburban perfection shattered into a million irreversible pieces, broadcasted live to millions of homes across America. Inside the tranquil estate grounds, the air smelled heavily of jasmine and sea salt. I reached the end of the white floral aisle, sliding my hand into Merrick's warm, steady palm. Maya Chin stood off to the side of the altar, tapping her earpiece with a frantic finger, whispering to ask if I wanted her to pull up the live gate feed on a tablet so I could watch them unravel completely. I shook my head. My answer was an absolute, peaceful no. Standing in the very first row was my sister Waverly, who had quietly chosen to watch the broadcast from inside the estate after finally breaking away from our parents' toxic orbit. She looked down at her hands, her eyes heavy with the weight of realization, but she didn't try to stop the ceremony. I looked back at Connor, my husband-to-be, my rock, my safe harbor, and smiled. I didn't need to watch my parents destroy themselves at the gate. They had already done it. We exchanged our vows under the sprawling floral arch, the ceremony concluding not with a bitter family execution, but with a magnificent celebration of reclaimed agency, absolute truth, and unconditional love. The sun was already casting a brilliant, golden glow across the Pacific Ocean the next morning when my phone vibrated persistently on the wooden nightstand of our Malibu hotel suite. It was a call from Elena Ruiz, the senior civil rights attorney who had helped us coordinate the legal filings. She was calling to deliver the explosive overnight fallout from the national broadcast. "Sloan, it's a bloodbath in the corporate world," Elena said, her voice bright and victorious over the speaker. 3 separate corporate boards where your father held executive advisory seats held emergency midnight meetings. They have demanded Thaddeus Thorne's immediate, unceremonious resignation. His reputation is completely radioactive. She paused, taking a breath before dropping the next bombshell. Furthermore, the state attorney general's office watched the live broadcast, saw your father's on-air confession regarding the financial kickbacks, and formally opened a criminal fraud investigation into Thorne Logistics and the defunct Serenity Pines assets. And to top it all off, a massive class action lawsuit filed by dozens of former facility residents has officially been greenlit, naming your parents as primary financial beneficiaries of corporate abuse. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling a massive, invisible boulder finally roll off my chest. I thanked Elena, hung up the phone, and tossed it onto the bed. The corporate wreckage of my parents' carefully constructed empire accumulated rapidly over the next 3 months, tearing through their luxurious suburban life like a Category 5 hurricane. Terrified that the growing public backlash and criminal subpoenas would expose their own underwriting liabilities, the corporate insurance providers handling Thaddeus's old shell companies demanded an emergency out-of-court civil mediation. They desperately wanted to avoid handing those financial documents over to federal regulatory agencies. By May, the legal teams hammered out a massive, comprehensive civil settlement agreement. Thaddeus and the insurance companies were forced to fund a substantial, multi-million-dollar compensation trust dedicated entirely to supporting survivors of Serenity Pines and similar abusive institutions. To cover his share of the massive financial penalties and mounting legal defense fees, my parents were forced to quietly liquidate their extensive investment portfolio, empty their savings accounts, and list their sprawling, upscale suburban family home for sale. The house where I had been locked out of the kitchen, the house where they had burned my letters, was stripped away by the very greed that built it. Meanwhile, the state licensing board permanently revoked Leonard Pike and every administrator's operational certification associated with the facility, ensuring those monsters could never run a youth care center or prey on vulnerable children ever again. Waverly and I did not magically become inseparable best friends overnight, despite the dramatic resolution of our family war. But we started seeing a licensed family trauma specialist every other Tuesday in a neutral therapy office that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. We slowly learned how to occupy the same room without slipping back into our assigned childhood roles of golden child and scapegoat. My younger sister worked long, exhausting, 80-hour weeks at a mid-level marketing firm across the city, just to cover her own modest rent and groceries. She was finally learning how to navigate the real world without the safety net of our parents' stolen bank accounts or Corin's lazy freelancing. The moment the money vanished, Corin had packed his bags and disappeared from her life without a backward glance. I paid strictly for my half of our professional therapy sessions, but I never once wrote Waverly a bailout check to ease her transition into adulthood. We both understood that a genuine relationship could only be built on mutual respect and accountability, and throwing money at the problem would only repeat the generational cycle of control. A thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at my federal office in late May. I recognized the sweeping, aggressive cursive handwriting immediately, and a faint, sickening trace of my mother's expensive floral perfume still clung stubbornly to the paper. Inside, Rowena begged for a single phone call. She spent 3 entire pages detailing exactly how much she missed her daughters, complaining bitterly about losing their Malibu-style mansion, and blaming my stubbornness for tearing the family apart piece by piece. The woman still could not formulate a single question asking how I was actually doing, or showing an ounce of genuine remorse for what she had done to me. I didn't waste a single drop of breath or energy drafting a reply. I simply dropped the letter into my shredder basket, letting the machine chew it into tiny, unrecognizable strips of paper. June arrived with a warm, steady coastal breeze. I stood inside the climate-controlled archive room of the newly established Survivor Support Foundation, a nonprofit organization funded partially by the Settlement Trust, dedicated to helping youth facility survivors rebuild their lives. I held the small, velvet-lined evidence box containing my original, yellowed hospital bracelet. That faded plastic band had defined my existence for 21 years, acting as a constant, heavy psychological anchor reminding me of the false, suffocating narrative my parents had forced upon me. They had spent over 2 decades deciding exactly who I was, what I was worth, and how my story would end. But the final decision had always belonged entirely to me. I placed the velvet box onto a clean, cold metal shelving unit, resting it right next to the digitized copies of the unedited mini-DV videotape and the financial ledgers. I didn't keep the hollow illusion of a picture-perfect, toxic family. Instead, I kept my own name, my brilliant husband, my federal career, my unyielding boundaries, and the absolute, sacred right to choose exactly who crossed the threshold into my life. I closed the heavy archive door, the electronic lock clicking solidly and satisfyingly into place. A junior foundation coordinator met me down the hallway, carrying a fresh stack of manila intake folders under her arm. The young coordinator stopped, gesturing quietly toward the front glass reception area of the building. She told me, with a hint of urgency in her voice, that a frightened 16-year-old girl had just walked into the lobby, trembling and looking desperately for legal help because her parents had just threatened to ship her away to a residential behavioral modification center. I turned my head, looking down the bright corridor toward the frosted glass doors of the waiting room. My personal revenge crusade against my parents was officially over. But the actual, meaningful work of saving others was just beginning. I adjusted the strap of my leather briefcase, took a deep, steady breath, and walked out to meet her. When the people who are supposed to protect you turn your own life into a business, you learn very quickly that silence is never a safe compromise. True strength is not about orchestrating a grand, cinematic retaliation just to prove your worth to those who fundamentally refuse to see it. It is about setting unbreakable boundaries, refusing to let someone else control your narrative, and fiercely protecting your inner peace. Justice is rarely about making your enemies suffer in the dark. It is about calling the truth by its exact name, shining a blinding spotlight on the shadows, and stopping the cycle of abuse before it destroys someone else. Ask yourself this: when the people who claim to love you demand your silence as the price of belonging, how far would you go to protect your own voice? Thank you for listening to my story until the very end. The most painful betrayals sometimes come from those who claim to be family, but the truth always finds a way to shine through most brightly. If you or someone you know has ever experienced similar hurt from toxic relationships, never keep that silence to yourself. Share this story to spread healing energy and awakening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to follow the channel for more real-life drama stories. See you soon.